Hello team and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MSP. This is Ukraine War Update Extra video, giving you extra tidbits and nuggets to get your teeth into to give you a greater understanding of the war in Ukraine. And I am going to go through a number of different sort of articles and reports, a couple of RUSI reports, Royal United Services Institute, UK military think tank, and Zaluzhny's essay that he wrote for, well, that he gave to The Economist that they could put in their archives, I guess, and piece together some ideas about both the forthcoming winter and also about electronic warfare. So, some people have asked me in the comments to do some commentary on electronic warfare. I will have to admit, though, this is largely going to be me reading from a number of different sources and interjecting with my commentary. So bear that in mind. A lot of reading. It's another day of the ATP Geopolitics Book Club. So we're going to start with the winter situation. This is a RUSI report by Dr. Jack Watling, which is really good. And I was going through this. It's called Ukraine Must Prepare for a Hard Winter. I was going through this, trying to pick out the bits that I should highlight, the pertinent excerpts from here. And I realized that it was the entire thing. So I'm going to broadly read most of it to you. So the lack of a breakthrough in Ukraine's summer offensive and a shift to material advantage mean that Kyiv must fight carefully if it is to retain the initiative. Okay, so we're going to talk about attrition and initiative. Both Russia and Ukraine have struggled to generate offensive combat power in 2023. The heavy attrition of experienced junior officers and trained field-grade staff has limited the scale at which offensive action can be synchronized. Combined with terrain that contains fighting and the canalizing effect of dense minefields, Ukrainian forces have been restricted to company-scale operations. When they have expanded the scale of operations, Ukrainian forces have found that they lose synchronization and with their supporting arms. Russia has similarly struggled to synchronize and coordinate larger scale activities, but this has not prevented it from attempting them at great cost to personnel and materiel. So this is the idea that given all the fortifications that Ukraine have come across, they've ended up having to do things on much smaller scale as they are negotiating their way through individual fields with dug in trench lines in, or small trench lines in the tree lines, and mines all over the shop, right? So as the sappers work through then they're kind of going through in small channels with smaller groups of equipment because there's too many bits of equipment and they all get lost all at once, which is what kind of happened in the initial stages at Malotokmachka, for example. So things have got more granular and they can't do these big sweeping maneuvers where they're taking loads of land and moving at 30 kilometers a day and all that kind of stuff that Zaluzhny was talking about the other day. Russia have struggled to do things on large scale, but it's been slightly different. They just kind of ignored all of those things and not gone small, gone large, but then lost an awful lot of equipment in so doing. Now, you could say that they've made that calculation that it's worth it, and as long as they do get to that tree line and do take that next field, they are moving forward, then the loss of huge amounts of equipment and personnel is by the by. But both sides have struggled to do effective large-scale maneuvers synchronizing with different elements. For both sides, he continues, the ability to expand the scale at which they can operate effectively is constrained by training opportunities. Ukrainian units committed to the front struggle to be pulled far enough from the Russians to train at larger scale. Russia, meanwhile, is having to commit many of its replacement troops to keep up the strength of its units in the front because of its high rate of casualties. So long as this high casualty rate can be maintained, therefore, it becomes possible to suppress Russia's ability to train sufficient new troops to the standard needed to effectively conduct offensive action. I mean, translated is, if you're attriting the Russians so quickly, then they have to bring in untrained troops to the front line, and that's a continual thing, and so that will get their force quality degraded and on a consistent basis. Now, if you're going forward, and it goes on to talk about this a bit later, but if you're going forward into the winter time, then actually there is this argument that Ukraine can't just sit back and reconstitute, that they have to keep the pressure up in a number of places. It goes on to later say partly because otherwise Russia will build up their fortifications, but also they'll be able to train their troops adequately, arguably, if they're not being pressured. So if sustaining a high casualty rate suppresses Russia's ability to regain the initiative, the question becomes whether Ukraine and its international partners can refine the training pipeline, better connecting training inside and outside of Ukraine to enable Ukraine to exploit the opportunity in the spring. This is complicated by the need to keep up the pressure on Russian forces. So on the one hand, they need to train en masse large numbers of Ukrainian forces, but on the other hand, they need to be attacking. And you've got to somehow marry those two objectives up. I would also say, and so many people have been talking about this, that the NATO training needs to be improved so that it's fit for purpose, the purpose being war in Ukraine, not war that NATO's used to. We're talking about how do you manage minefields in a way that NATO have never really had to deal with. We've heard previously that some of the NATO training has been, well, as Ukrainian officers troops have said, well, how do we negotiate this minefield? And the NATO trainers have said, well, you just go around it. It's like, yeah, there's 300 kilometers of minefields here, mate. We're not going around a mine. It's not a minefield. This is a mined front here. So there needs to be a sense of adapting to the needs of the Ukrainians. Okay, so to continue, during the winter of 22 to 23, much of the front saw intense skirmishing, but only limited Ukrainian attempts to significantly alter the line of control. The lack of the threat of offensive action by the Ukrainians allowed Russia, this is what it's talking about, to build 3 extensive defense lines with mines, trenches, and obstacles, which made Ukraine's offensive operations this summer an order of magnitude more difficult. If Ukraine does not continue to pressure the Russian line in the winter, the risk is that these defense lines are expanded. Thus, Kyiv must balance reconstitution with the need to keep up pressure on Russian forces. Okay, so that's one important point there. So now we're going on to talk about materiel. So Ukraine will face further challenges because of the shifting balance of materiel advantage. Over the summer, Ukraine gained fire's superiority for the first time, delivering more rounds per day into Russian positions than came back in many sectors. This was critical to the progress made, but saw an ammunition consumption rate above 200,000 rounds per month. Of course, this then presents challenges for the supply of that ammunition. Now, we know that Ukraine are ramping up their own production indigenously, and that NATO forces are ramping up their production as well in order to provide more, well, to backfill their own stocks and also to provide Ukraine. Sufficient ammunition to sustain this rate of fire, he continues, is not going to be forthcoming as NATO stockpiles deplete and production rates for ammunition remain too low to meet the level of demand. On the Russian side, by comparison, production has turned a corner. Not only is Russian domestic ammunition production rising rapidly, but new ammunition production is being supplied from Iran, North Korea, and other states. Bottlenecks in spare barrels and other critical parts will prevent Russia from establishing fire's dominance for the next quarter. While NATO production should increase later in 2024, but for a while, Ukraine faces a challenge of maintaining Russian attrition without an abundance of artillery. Okay, let's unpick that a little bit. So the disadvantage for Ukraine is that Russia are ramping up their own production and are able to get, for example, 1 million shells from North Korea, a large amount of shells from allied nations. That presents a real issue. However, the advantage for Ukraine, the disadvantage for Russia, is that they have had a huge degradation of their own artillery capability, their own capacity of artillery. And that is down to several things. One is the effective work of counter-battery fire and just general drone activity and the targeting, the explicit targeting since the beginning of the counteroffensive of Russian artillery. It has been hugely successful, and the amount of pieces of artillery lost by the Russians is huge. You can have all the ammunition you like, but if you don't have the ammunition pieces, the artillery pieces to fire that ammunition, then it doesn't really matter. The other issue that the Russians have had is the poor maintenance of their howitzers, the barrels being worn down. That's partly just the nature of the beast. If you're going to fire 60,000 rounds a day or whatever it is they were at the peak, then you are going to wear your barrels out. And at some point, those barrels are going to need replacing. So we've seen that they've been stripping howitzers from Russia that have been stored for decades, but then those barrels have been stored for decades in the open and are not in a good shape. And so the range and accuracy of the Russian artillery is diminished. And that means that, that you might be getting a whole load of shells from North Korea and Iran, but you either don't have the artillery pieces or you do have them and they are poor in terms of range and in terms of accuracy. So that could provide an ongoing advantage to the Ukrainians, even given their lack of artillery ammunition themselves. Another challenge lies in air defense. The one plausible path towards Russia gaining a decisive advantage on the battlefield if its aerospace forces are able to begin bombing from medium altitude, significantly increasing the accuracy of their strikes. So what they do, when you have guided glide bombs, these FAB 500, you get a longer range out of them if you drop them from higher up, obviously, so they have further to fall. And as they're kind of falling in a diagonal trajectory, because they've got fins and guidance and whatnot, that they are able to get a longer range. The problem is, the higher you go, the more susceptible you are as an aircraft to air defense systems. So you need to be lower down so you're not acquired as a target by radars, and so you're generally safer. Now, if they are able to fly higher, that will mean that they'll be able to hit further into Ukrainian territory and hit higher value targets, not just ones that they, the ones that are on the front line, and they are the only ones they can hit because they can't get any closer or get any higher. In this light, Russia's to do this, they would need to denude Ukraine of its air defenses. In this light, Russia's impending strikes on Ukrainian critical national infrastructure remain a strategic threat. If Russia can destroy the ability to pump water in Ukraine's cities during periods of cold temperature, pipes will burst, potentially rendering urban areas uninhabitable. Thus, the missiles must be intercepted, but interceptors are a scarce commodity. For Russia, the supply of strike and munitions is increasing. In October 2022, Russia was producing approximately 40 long-range missiles a month. Now it is producing over 100 a month. And this is supplemented by large numbers of Garan 2 drones. So those are the Shahid drones. Furthermore, on October the 18th, the UN Security Council restrictions on Iran's missile program lapsed. Russia has been pushing for Iran to supply it with missiles after that date, with an expectation that this will provide a large supply of missiles in the winter. Not only that, there's now recent claims, like today I reported that Russia are also getting missiles from North Korea. This is all looking really challenging for the Ukrainians. I won't lie to you. I think the missile and drone threat is huge. Now, luckily, Ukraine's air defense systems have improved vastly from the beginning of the war, like orders of magnitude. However, will it be enough to defend their key infrastructure points and military targets from an overwhelming use of, I think, what will be a huge number of cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, and drones? We'll have to wait and see. I guess NATO's ability to expand the production of interceptors and radar for air defenses is therefore critical. So in order to match that, NATO forces or NATO countries need to be building more Patriot Nazams and other missiles than you can poke a hairy stick at. So now moving on to the next section, Watling says, despite these threats, Ukraine has options for continuing to cause Russia's position in southern Ukraine to deteriorate. Long-range strikes using ATACMS destroyed electronic warfare helicopters and have been important for protecting Russian forces from a range of effects. Carefully orchestrated attacks on Russian air defenses are also making a range of softer targets more vulnerable. Once these gaps open, Ukraine can maximize the efficiency of the limited stocks of GIMLRs it possesses to destroy and disrupt Russian logistics. So we are going to, hopefully, the intention would be you get to a tipping point at some point where the air defenses have been sufficiently degraded where you can start using more HIMARS, but also maybe JDAMs, GLSDBs, ground launch small diameter bombs. When they start coming in, they're going to be super useful, and indigenous missiles that they're producing, as well as drones and ATACMS and cruise missiles. You start, it's almost like a snowball effect. You take out more air defenses and more air defenses, you can have more and more effect with the missiles you do send. And in the end, there's very little chance of shooting this stuff down because you degraded the air defenses so much. So that's why I said the other day, I would just be making sure my job number one is hunt down every single bloody S300 and S400 system you can find and destroy it. Destroy. Air defense systems have to be taken out. At the same time, if a massed breakthrough is looking less likely, Ukraine can exploit the width of the front to keep Russian forces in the field as the weather deteriorates. Recent attacks across the Dnipro, for example, expand the frontage that Russian troops must defend, reducing the number of forces that can be pulled back and trained or reconstituted. Actions that make progress where the Russians have left themselves vulnerable can be rapidly exploited. Russian commanders cannot therefore simply trade space on their flanks. This is again one of those trade-offs, which is you attack, the more places you attack, the more diluted you are going to be. The fewer places you attack, the more stronger you're going to be in terms of the number of forces. But also, if you're only attacking a few places, then the defenders will have more forces. They can commit to only a few hotspots on the front line. So it's trying to work out how best to use your forces to stretch out the enemy whilst also hopefully punching through where they are weak. And this is their kind of the deep battle doctrine of the Soviet army in times past, where you're kind of attacking everywhere, try and find a weak spot, and as soon as you find that weak spot, then you kind of pile in there. I don't know whether that's something they'll be trying to do over the winter when they've got all these other needs as well, reconstituting. The winter again poses an opportunity to maximize Russian losses. If Russian troops are drawn into the defense along a wide front, Ukrainian troops pushing into opportunities rather than trying to break through defended areas, and Russian forces will be outside getting wet and cold. If targeted strikes can degrade their logistics and the limited training and fieldcraft of Russian forces can maximize climactic injuries, it is notable that Russian casualties last winter were exceedingly high, even when Russia had fire's superiority. Further activity in the Black Sea is also important. Firstly, expanding the threat to the Crimean Peninsula spreads out increasingly threatened and scarce defensive systems like the S-400. Secondly, the progressive erosion of the Black Sea Fleet's freedom of maneuver helps to set the conditions for the isolation of Crimea in 2024. While these conditions can be created, however, they are all dependent upon the Ukrainians being able to reconstitute. With Washington embroiled in political dysfunction, the assurances needed to plan for 2024 would increasingly fall on European capitals. Thus, for Ukraine's international partners, the task of creating the conditions for a successful campaign in 2024 must be committed to today. Really good, succinct piece there. It's not too long. Thanks for that, Jack Watling, who is always worth a read or a listen. Now we're going to move on to electronic warfare, and I think to set the, stage for this, we'll dip into a BBC news article from fairly recently, 4th of August, Ukraine's invisible battle to jam Russia's weapons, and we just dip into little bits here and there. So it joins a team. It says their job is to detect electronic signals from all kinds of Russian weapons, including drones, air defense systems, jammers, artillery, and multiple rocket launchers. They work out where the signals originate and a type of weapon, then pass on coordinates to other units that will aim to destroy the target. So that's very much like counter battery sort of activity there, where they are acquiring targets by finding electronic signals that they can home in on. The information also helps commanders build up a picture of the battlefield. Quote, "This is a war of technologies," Colonel Ivan Pavlenko, chief of the Ukrainian General Staff's Electronic and Cyber Warfare Department, tells the BBC. Quote, "If I see a number of radio stations in the same place, I understand it's a command post. If I see some radio stations begin to move forward, I understand it could be a counter-offensive or an offensive." Almost every modern weapon, from artillery installations to high precision missiles, use radio waves, microwaves, infrared, or other frequencies to receive data. This makes them vulnerable to electronic warfare, which aims to intercept and suppress those signals. Quote, if you're losing in electronic warfare, your forces will turn into a 19th century army, says Yaroslav Kalinin, chief executive of Zahist, a company that produces electronic warfare systems for the Ukrainian army. Quote, you will be 10 steps behind your enemy. In recent years, Russia has developed a range of jamming technology. So this is from Russia, and this includes a Krasukha 4, which targets airborne and air defense radars, the Zhitel, which suppresses satellite signals, and I've shown you a number of Zhitel 330B taken out recently or over the past few months, and the Layer 3, a cellular and radio communications jammer. By the time of the full-scale invasion in February 2022, Russia had 18,000 electronic warfare troops, Colonel Pavlenko says, but the effect was less impressive than many had expected. Quote, they were trying to break down our radars to penetrate our air defense systems, says Kalinin. They were partially successful at this, but not completely. And it talks a little bit about how they failed in those early weeks with the suppression of enemy air defenses and that kind of activity to take out Ukrainian electronic warfare installations. Expecting a walkover, Moscow may have thought they wouldn't need to fully deploy electronic warfare systems, but Brian Clark, a senior fellow at Hudson Institute, a US think tank, says another problem was that electronic warfare units couldn't keep up with the rest of the troops. Quote, Russian systems are large, unwieldy, vehicle-borne systems that are designed to be on the defensive, he says, and as a result, their electronic warfare systems weren't very agile, they weren't very fast, and they weren't very numerous. And this is something we're going to come and talk about a little bit in another RUSI report from recently concerning electronic warfare, will include stuff on electronic warfare, to say how in that context the Russians have adapted. But Russia, and it says it here, but Russia has learned from its mistakes, he says. Instead of using large equipment that can be easily spotted and destroyed, it's now increasingly relying on smaller, more mobile devices. Brian Clark says Russia has managed to deploy hundreds of mobile electronic warfare units along the front line in an attempt to slow down Ukraine's counteroffensive. These range from GPS jammers to systems that suppress radar and prevent US aircraft identifying targets for Ukraine to attack. Russian systems such as Zhitel and Pol 21 are proving to be particularly effective to jam GPS and other satellite links. They can disable drones that direct artillery fire and carry out kamikaze attacks on Russian troops. Many of these sophisticated weapons provided to Ukraine by NATO countries are vulnerable to such jamming too, because they use a GPS signal for navigation. And just to finish off here, Zhitel can jam GPS signals within 30 kilometers of the jammer, says Mr. Clark. For weapons like the US-made JDAM bombs, which use a GPS receiver to guide it to the target, that's sufficient to lose its geolocation and go off target. And we've heard a lot about how JDAMs, particularly initially, had a lot of problem with being jammed, and that's why we didn't see them get used so much, because they'd go off target, and then the way I understand it, the fuse didn't ignite the bomb as a kind of safety mechanism for being off target, and so they were kind of rendered effective. The same applies to the guided rockets fired by the HIMARS multiple rocket system, which made a big contribution to Ukraine's successful offensive last autumn. Both sides have been trying to develop countermeasures against each other's jamming, including reprogramming weapons. And it's this, as I talked about before, the measure, the countermeasure, the countermeasure, and it's this evolution of different capabilities from the defensive and offensive sides to try and outwit the other side. Right, we're now going to build a little bit on this by dipping into only 2 paragraphs here from another RUSI piece of writing. This is a special report again from Jack Watling, but Jack Watling and Nick Reynolds, that came out in September this year. Stormbreak: Fighting Through Russia's Defenses in Ukraine's 2023 Offensive. And we're going to go to the section on Russian adaptation, which is Russian lessons and adaptation. And we're going to pop into, as I say, just a couple of paragraphs. So here they say the use of attack aviation has posed a consistent challenge for Ukrainian forces throughout the counter-offensive. The foremost threat comes from the Ka-52 Alligators firing Vickers and Attacker ATGMs, anti-tank guided missiles. However, so these are ones that have a greater range than the ATGMs that, or the manpads that would be firing against the helicopters themselves from the ground. So if you're holding a Stinger man portable air defense system, that'll have maybe a 5-kilometer range. Whereas these have, as it says a little later, 8 to 10 kilometers, actually more than that, some of these extended range ones. So, however, the Russians have also begun mounting Attacker and Mi-35Ms, which also engage in area effect strikes utilizing salvos of lofted S-8 rockets. Aviation strikes are launched from a depth of approximately 8 to 10 kilometers from the target. Ukrainian forces note the presence of attack aviation is often heralded by the lifting of GPS jamming among Russian formations, reflecting the need for precise navigation in order to coordinate strikes. Given that both armies are using many of the same platforms, Russian helicopter groups are often flying with an EW-equipped helicopter for defensive purposes, equipped with directional pods aimed at targeting radar. So in other words, when the Ukrainians know that there's going to be a helicopter attack in the near future because suddenly they can't fly drones and they're being jammed, and the Russians themselves will be jammed from using drones or whatnot because the helicopters need it for their targeting, and they have a helicopter coming alongside which is accompanying the attack helicopters, that is an electronic warfare equipped helicopter for those defensive purposes. The Russians are having to keep helicopters relatively close to the front, making their forward arming and refueling points and other infrastructure vulnerable. Nevertheless, shortage of Ukrainian tactical air defense, a low altitude maintained by these assets, and the limited period during which they are in the hover to deliver effects all make countering attack aviation difficult. Of course, this is prior to the ATACMS hitting the Berdyansk and Luhansk airports. Continues after a paragraph or so. One area of continued Russian adaptation, but also improvement, is electronic warfare. Russian EW, electronic warfare, EW has been a major area of investment, and Russian EW operators tend to be technically competent. Nevertheless, Russian EW platforms have largely comprised modernized versions of Soviet equipment, which placed each type of effector on a single large platform, with formations of platforms providing a range of EW effects. The vulnerability of this approach has been recognized by the ATRF, given the targeting of specific emitters. This has, in the first instance, led to much more subtle employment of large platforms, such as the Jetel R330ZH. It has also driven a preference for the mounting of antenna on light platforms, or the dismounting and distribution of antenna that can be placed to cover tactical positions. The channeling for effects through antenna can therefore be carried out by EW suites that are not tied to the emitting signature. The loss of antenna when they are targeted is a cost that the Russian military feels it can bear. This is a transition in progress, and so is not a uniform approach. Nevertheless, the preference to use systems such as Pol 21 and to treat them as disposable systems in order to provide wide area protection from drone strikes reflects a change in mindset and how the Russian electronic warfare branch is learning from the conflict. So they are adapting. Their electronic warfare is effective, or becoming more effective, as they are using their platforms in smaller, more adapted ways. Now, if we go to look at Zaluzhny's essay that he provided for The Economist, he has a section on electronic warfare. He says, as for electronic warfare, even before the events of 2014, the military and political leadership of the Russian Federation, notice how he doesn't capitalize Russian Federation in this piece, paid considerable attention to the development of electronic warfare. An illustrative example of this is the creation in 2009 of a separate branch of the armed forces of the Russian Federation, the Electronic Warfare Troops. In addition, as part of the Russian armed forces, a powerful air component of electronic warfare has been created, which ensures the effective employment of troops or forces and high-precision weapons. The enemy adopted about 60 types of modern electronic warfare equipment, which have better characteristics, high mobility, increased security, short setup and teardown time, the introduction of new technical solutions, automation tools, special software, etc. Almost the entire fleet of obsolete equipment has been updated. Now, the main advantages of Russian electronic warfare equipment also include the establishment of serial production of the so-called trench electronic warfare, Silok, Piton, Harpoon, Pered, Strij, and Lysychok, which the tactical level of the Russian troops is saturated with, despite the fact that since the beginning of large-scale armed aggression, the enemy has lost a significant part of this equipment. Today, it continues to maintain a significant electronic warfare superiority. So this is the admission from Zaluzhny that the Russians have the advantage here. However, we must also question why Zaluzhny is freely giving all this information out to the world and basically saying, Russia, you're better at us than us at this, and I'm going to announce this publicly. So Russia are getting that information. Now, if that's fully accurate, then what is the point of him saying this? There's possibly more rationale to suggest what he's saying isn't wholly accurate, but I don't know. And I don't know in this context, in this particular context of electronic warfare, whether what he's saying is truly accurate and the Russians do have electronic warfare superiority. There has been the understanding that they certainly did at the beginning of the war with the existing equipment that both sides had. Whether that is still the case now, given all the myriad bits of kit that allies have given to Ukraine, I just don't know. Today, it continues to maintain a significant electronic warfare superiority, he says. Along the Kupiansk and Bakhmut axes, the enemy actually established a layered electronic warfare system, the elements of which constantly change their location. Talking about Zhitel, which he's not mentioned here, but was mentioned in the previous piece, the Russi piece. There have been now, these are worth $25 million each, I think. There have been 5 of those at least, or is it 6 now? Certainly 5 that have been known to have been destroyed, which is really significant. So there is a degradation of the Russian stocks of some of this equipment. Whether that's enough to affect a change, I don't know. As for the armed forces of Ukraine, by 2022, such modern electronic warfare assets with drones such as Bukovel AD, Enclave, Khamara, and Nota were adopted, which later proved themselves well in combat. But despite this, at the beginning of the war, about 65% of jamming stations types in units, elements of the armed forces of Ukraine, were produced by the former Soviet Union, and there were only 25 new ones. So this is the idea that certainly at the beginning of the war, Russia had the advantage. Given the limited capability, I mean, think of the Soviet Union as 1991, right? So this is a long time ago. Some of this equipment is very old, and given the evolution of technology, that would be a bit of an issue. Given the limited capabilities of the domestic defense industrial complex, the build-up of electronic warfare capabilities was carried out at the expense of international military materiel and logistical assistance by obtaining systems or assets of detection and electronic warfare against drones, anti-drone guns, tactical mobile direction finding systems, electronic warfare systems, and on-board radar stations, etc. To date, the capabilities to counter enemy high-precision weapons, so guided missiles, drones, are being increased by deploying the Pokrova nationwide electronic warfare system with the possibility of replacing the satellite radio navigation field or spoofing, suppressing satellite radio navigation along the entire line of contact and in most parts of Ukraine. Now, this is interesting. This is not something I know about, so I'm going to have to look into Pokrova, but it seems, rather than it being just a localized electronic warfare bit of kit, the idea here, he claims, is it can take out Russian capability along an entire line of contact. Now, one might ask, therefore, whether this would also affect Ukrainian electronic signatures or whatnot. So I don't know. The development and implementation of elements of situational awareness systems into command and control processes is also underway. Graphite, for automated transmission and display of data about the flight of small drones. Quartz, for collecting, these are names of the systems, processing, displaying data, and managing radio electronic assets. At this time, we have practically achieved a parity in the electronic warfare tasks performance, which significantly complicates the possibility of achieving superiority by both the armed forces of the Russian Federation and Ukraine when employing weapons and troops in general. So in other words, Ukraine has come a long way, and even though Russia did initially have the advantage with electronic warfare system, they're approaching parity, which means that both sides are screwed, essentially. That will lead to a difficulty for either side to generate any kind of advantage and therefore translate that into taking territory. Thus, relying on a strategic superiority in military, economic, human, natural resource, and scientific potential and relatively appropriate conditions for its implementation, the occupying armed forces are still not able to fully implement the plans of the Russian General Staff. At the same time, it should be noted that despite this countermeasure to the achievement of military political objectives by the aggressor state comes at a high cost for Ukraine and its armed forces. The above is especially acute in the current course of the counteroffensive actions in the summer-autumn period. Thus, de facto, the armed forces of Ukraine and other components of the security and defence forces involved in repelling armed aggression practically along the entire line of contact between the parties and in the border areas with the Russian Federation faced the need to overcome the military parity problem. In other words, that's a massively long sentence to say that there's this parity, and it screwed us all. And during the summer counteroffensive, we were unable to take to make much gain because of that parity of electronic warfare capability. First of all, its existence is stipulated by the reasons related to parity in the air, minefields, counter battery, and electronic warfare, and the creation of reserves. So, I mean, I guess the takeaway point here is that they have developed. But it goes on to say we need new technological capabilities. Although it says it's not going to be one panacea, but an accumulation of all these different areas where they might have little bits of competitive advantage. Putting them all together gives them this cumulative advantage. But there is this need for Ukraine to have a competitive advantage in this field, and it's so very important in terms of defending against the very best of the Russian weapons. So there you go. That's just a little survey of different opinions and different claims concerning electronic warfare, and we've looked at what Ukraine might want to consider going into the winter. Okay, I'm now going to allow actor from Game of Thrones, Jack Gleeson, who I presume is Brendan Gleeson's son, maybe, and Domhnall Gleeson's brother, maybe, I don't know, that's just a guess, reads a poem by Serhiy Zhadan at the event of the Talented You in London on the 2nd of November. The poetry from 2000, so this is 20 years old, previously published but in the New York Times, still sounds terribly relevant. Talented You wrote. So just time for a bit of poetry. And fun fact before we go on, let's have a look. I wrote a book. I edited a book, and it is a book of poetry called Filling the Void. So if anyone wants to, it is humanist poetry, so it's not going to be for everyone. But if you like poetry, there's a book there that you can get your hands on. Called Filling the Void, a selection of humanist and atheist poetry. Yeah, there you go. Anyway, so poetry's your thing. Is that right? This is him reading a poem, and I'll leave you with this.
Headphones. Sasha, a quiet drunk, an esoteric, a poet, spent the entire summer in the city. When the shooting began, he was surprised. Started watching the news, then stopped. He walks around the city with headphones on, listening to golden oldies as he stumbles into burned out cars, blown up bodies. What will survive from the history of the world in which we lived will be the words and music of a few geniuses who desperately tried to warn us, tried to explain, but failed to explain anything or save anyone. These geniuses lie in cemeteries, and out of their rib cages grow flowers and grass. Nothing else will remain, only their music and songs, a voice that forces you to love. You can choose to never turn off this music. Listen to the cosmos and shut your eyes. Think about whales in the ocean at night. Hear nothing else. See nothing else. Feel nothing else. Except, of course, for the smell. The smell of corpses. That's it.